Sego. In today's video, by Patreon poll, we are going to be taking a look at Iroquoian agriculture. Like most agricultural nations in North America, the Iroquois used the Three Sisters. The Three Sisters being three crops that are planted in the same spot which complement each other. These crops being corn, which you can see all around me, beans, and squash. Now, I had no practical experience with this concept. Hardly anyone grows them in this way anymore. So in order to give myself something to talk about, I did a little experiment this year. The only thing I know about growing this style is that the corn should go in when the oak leaves are the size of squirrel's ears. And then the beans should go in much later, and then the squash later than that. Corn being the slowest growing. Historically, they were planted in mounds with enough space to walk in between the mounds. These mounds were a bit like compost piles. Underneath them you'd bury things like sticks and leaves, but also table scraps and bits of meat and bones left over from skinning and tanning, mussel shells and fish heads and the like, because even plants prefer to eat meat when they can. The theory behind the Three Sisters is as follows. The squash fill out with great big leaves and choke out the weeds and keep the soil moist from the shade. The corn grows so tall that it isn't choked out by the squash. And it provides a pole for the beans to climb up so that they aren't choked out either. The beans contribute by putting nitrogen into the soil, which helps the other two grow. I was surprised at the effectiveness of the beans. When the corn first started to sprout, it was looking pretty yellow and anemic, but a week or so after I put the beans in, it turned all nice and green. Three Sisters style agriculture can produce much more food per square meter than you can if you plant them independently, because the plants complement each other rather than competing. However, there are a couple of caveats to this. One of them is it's a much messier way of growing. Corn by itself can be grown in these nice neat rows that you can walk between easily, whereas squash just goes everywhere. Squash by itself is relatively low-lying and you can just step over it, but with the corn in the way you can't do that. Another shortcoming to the Three Sisters is that it requires a great deal more skill. You need to get the timings right. You can't just plant them all at once. It's like what people say about daughters. If they're born too close together, they'll just fight. If the beans go in before the corn is properly established, they'll start to wrap around the leaves or the developing cobs of corn and choke them out. Worse still, if the squash goes in too soon, it might put out little suckers and just pull the corn stalks right over. This was a very interesting experiment. In retrospect, I probably should have done a bit of reading before I tried it, but you learn by making mistakes. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about the traditional varieties of corn, beans, and squash, because they're different from the modern. Modern sweet corn is designed to be sweet, whereas traditional flint corn is designed to preserve well. As such, it's much less sweet, much starchier, and it's got a much thicker, harder shell around each kernel. The shell on the corn is a problem. Even on modern corn, it's indigestible. There were several ways around it. The first one was to pick the corn when it wasn't fully ripe. You can't preserve it as well, but if you eat it quickly, it's just like corn on the cob. The second way was to take the dried corn and then pound it into a meal using a great big wooden mortar and pestle. This breaks up the shell and allows you to digest the interior. You can use this meal to make porridge or cornbread. If you wanted to be decadent, you could take that meal and then grind it into a flour on a stone quern. But this is a lot of extra work, so you wouldn't always bother with this. The third option was to make lied corn. You do this by soaking the corn in water and wood ash for a while and then washing it clean. The lye dissolves the hull and makes it soft. Then the corn inside expands and ruptures the hull, making it fall off. You can use the lied corn to make soup, or you can fry it up with herbs and spices. Or you can put it in a bowl with berries and maple syrup for a dessert. Just about every community had their own variety of corn. Some of the varieties have differences in terms of the practical side of things. For many of them, it's a question of aesthetics. Back in the day, most corn would spend the majority of its existence hanging from the ceiling in a braid. So if it's got nice colors, it can serve as decoration as well as food. Here's a good piece of Six Nations corn that was grown for the community. Here's a little wee one that I grew myself. As I said, it takes practice. There was a similar variety among the beans and the squash. These are an old-fashioned variety called skunk beans. In terms of taste, they're like really big kidney beans. I wasn't able to get my hands on a traditional variety of squash, but pumpkins and butternut squash are very similar to what was grown historically. Now I've talked about the advantages of the Three Sisters in terms of growing them, but on a nutritional level they're also a very good combination. You can survive for a very long time on just these 3 crops alone. The corn has got some incomplete fats in it, which your body needs to maintain your brain and your organs. The beans have got some incomplete proteins in them, which your body needs to maintain your muscles and other tissues. And the squash has got a wide variety of vitamins and minerals to help keep away things like scurvy. Because the proteins and fats are incomplete, you can't live off of these indefinitely. You need meat every now and again, but they can see you through the harder months. In addition to the 3 sisters, a number of other plants were also cultivated on some small scale. These included the 3 sacred herbs of tobacco, sweetgrass, and sage, but also medicinal herbs like yarrow, and things like milkweed and dogbane, which are very useful for making cordage. Fruit and nut trees were also grown, but that's a topic for another video. Anyway, this has been a brief overview of Iroquoian agriculture. I hope you found this interesting. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.